What if I told you that before the skyline, before the cable cars, before the legend, San Francisco was a fragile outpost clinging to wind and sand? Welcome to Robert's History. I'm Robert, and today we journey back to the 19th century to witness a city becoming itself. If you love thoughtful, honest storytelling, I invite you to subscribe and join our growing community. Please note that some visuals in this video are symbolic and may not perfectly match each detail, and I appreciate your understanding. Now, settle in, and I hope this story brings you a sense of nostalgia and quiet reflection. Before San Francisco became a symbol of ambition and reinvention, this land was known as Ahwast, meaning the place by the bay. It was home to the Yelamu people of the Ohlone, who lived in close relationship with the water, the hills, and the seasonal rhythms of the peninsula. Long before streets and cable cars, there were shell mounds, tool boats, and villages shaped by generations of knowledge. In 1769, the Spanish expedition led by Gaspar de Portola arrived, marking the beginning of a profound transformation. The Presidio was established as a military outpost, and Mission San Francisco de Asís, now known as Mission Dolores, became the spiritual and cultural center of Spanish settlement. These institutions reshaped the region's identity in lasting ways. By the early 19th century, a small settlement called Yerba Buena began to grow around what we now know as Portsmouth Square. Yet life here was not romantic or easy. The peninsula was windswept and sandy, edged with salt marshes and short on basic resources. Fresh water and firewood often had to be brought in by boat. When you stand in modern San Francisco today, it is almost impossible to imagine how isolated and fragile this place once felt. In 1848, everything changed. When gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada, Yerba Buena, soon renamed San Francisco, was transformed almost overnight. The population surged from about 1,000 residents to roughly 25,000 in just 2 years. If you try to picture that today, imagine a quiet coastal town suddenly swelling into a restless, crowded boom city. The harbor became one of the strangest sights in American history. Ships arrived daily carrying fortune seekers, but many were abandoned by their crews. Sailors rushed inland to chase gold, leaving behind what observers described as a forest of masts. Some of those vessels were later repurposed as warehouses, hotels, even jails. To make room for explosive growth, parts of the shoreline were filled in. The land beneath today's financial district was once open water. San Francisco quickly became a gateway for global trade and immigration, drawing people from Latin America, Europe, China, and beyond. It was chaotic, hopeful, and unmistakably American in its hunger for opportunity. As San Francisco surged with newcomers, it became one of the most multicultural cities in 19th century America, but that diversity unfolded in ways that were often turbulent and deeply human. Along the northern waterfront, Italian immigrants built what would become Fisherman's Wharf. Many of them came from fishing villages along the Ligurian coast. They brought with them small boats, family labor, and generations of maritime knowledge. Crab fishing, in particular, became a defining trade. If you have ever cracked open a Dungeness crab by the bay, you are tasting a tradition that began in those early immigrant communities who worked before dawn in cold Pacific waters. Not far away, Chinatown began to take shape. Formed in the early years of the gold rush, it grew into the oldest Chinatown in North America. For Chinese immigrants who faced discrimination and legal exclusion, it became a cultural and economic anchor. Shops, temples, family associations, and newspapers created a world within a world. Walking those streets today, you can still feel how layered that history is. Yet this same city had a rough and often lawless edge. The Barbary Coast district became notorious for gambling halls, saloons, prostitution, and violence. The practice known as Shanghaiing thrived there, where men were kidnapped or coerced onto ships as unwilling sailors. The gender imbalance was severe. In the early gold rush years, men vastly outnumbered women. In some social dances, men took on female roles simply so gatherings could function. Masquerade balls became popular, but the atmosphere was complicated. In 1863, the city passed a law prohibiting appearing in public in clothing not associated with one's assigned sex, a measure aimed at controlling gender expression. These tensions reveal a city experimenting with identity while struggling to impose order. San Francisco was vibrant and inventive, but it was also raw. Its diversity brought culture and opportunity, yet it also exposed deep anxieties about morality, gender, and power that were playing out in real time on its streets. By the late 19th century, Chinatown had become one of the most vital neighborhoods in San Francisco. At certain points, people of Chinese descent made up close to 1/5 of the city's population. What began as a refuge for gold rush migrants evolved into a dense and highly organized community filled with businesses, theaters, temples, herbal shops, and family associations. For many immigrants who were barred from other opportunities, Chinatown was not simply a neighborhood. It was protection, identity, and economic survival. But opportunity existed alongside hostility. Chinese residents faced repeated waves of racial violence, especially during periods of economic downturn. Anti-Chinese sentiment hardened into law with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal law to restrict immigration based on nationality. It sharply limited Chinese immigration and denied many the possibility of citizenship. Families were separated, communities were frozen in place. Public health crises added further strain. Between 1900 and 1904, an outbreak of bubonic plague led city officials to quarantine roughly 15 blocks of Chinatown. The response was controversial and often discriminatory, targeting Chinese residents in ways not applied elsewhere. Earlier burial grounds within the city had already been ordered closed, and cemeteries were relocated to Colma, south of San Francisco, permanently reshaping community traditions around death and remembrance. And yet, Chinatown endured. Merchants rebuilt, cultural festivals continued, institutions adapted. If you walk those streets today, you are not just seeing storefronts. You are witnessing the resilience of a community that survived exclusion, quarantine, and suspicion while holding tightly to its language, faith, and networks of mutual aid. That endurance is one of the most powerful stories in American urban history. As San Francisco expanded at breathtaking speed, its infrastructure struggled to keep up. Streets were muddy, water systems were unreliable, and sanitation was often inadequate. In 1850 and again in 1855, cholera outbreaks swept through the city, exposing just how fragile public health conditions were. These crises pushed local leaders to establish the state's first county hospital system, an important step toward organized medical care in California. The Sisters of Mercy played a key role in treating the sick, reminding us that much of early civic stability depended on private initiative and faith-based institutions. Political instability followed close behind public health challenges. Many residents believed the municipal government was deeply corrupt and ineffective. In response, groups known as vigilance committees formed in the 1850s. Claiming to defend law and order, they bypassed the courts and carried out extrajudicial punishments, including executions. To modernize, this raises difficult questions about justice, fear, and who gets to define order in a rapidly changing city. At the same time, enormous wealth was being consolidated. Railroad magnates known as the Big Four built lavish mansions atop Nob Hill, physically rising above the crowded streets below. Their success symbolized California's economic ascent, yet it also highlighted growing inequality. By the early 20th century, political corruption reached a dramatic peak under the influence of political boss Abe Roof, whose network of bribery and backroom deals ensnared city officials, including the mayor. San Francisco was dazzling and dynamic, but beneath the surface, it was wrestling with disease, inequality, and the constant tension between power and accountability. During the gold rush years, women were few in number but deeply influential. In a city where men vastly outnumbered women, their presence carried social and economic weight. Marriage prospects, business partnerships, and community stability often centered around the small population of women who chose to build lives in this rough frontier port. One of the earliest and most respected figures was Doña Juana Briones de Miranda, often remembered as a founding mother of San Francisco. A landowner, healer, and businesswoman, she bridged the Mexican and early American periods of the city's history. Her life reminds us that California's story did not begin with the gold rush alone. Religious women also played a critical civic role. In 1855, during a severe cholera outbreak, the Sisters of Mercy helped operate the city's first county hospital. Just 2 years later, they founded St. Mary's Hospital, the first Catholic hospital west of the Rocky Mountains. Their work brought structure and compassion to a city still struggling to define itself. Women ran boarding houses, restaurants, laundries, and retail shops. Some pursued greater independence by wearing men's clothing to access mobility or employment that society restricted to men. After 1863, city ordinances prohibiting cross-dressing led to arrests, reflecting anxiety about gender norms. Even so, women shaped San Francisco's early civic and economic life in ways that still echo today. By the late 19th century, San Francisco had earned a new nickname, the Paris of the West. After decades of chaos, disease, and rapid expansion, the city began to see itself not just as a boomtown, but as a cultural capital. Writers, performers, and intellectuals were drawn to its dramatic hills and restless energy. Mark Twain spent formative years here as a journalist, sharpening the wit that would define his voice. Robert Louis Stevenson also passed through, observing the city's contradictions with a traveler's curiosity. Their presence reflected something larger. San Francisco was no longer only chasing gold. It was shaping ideas. Innovation defined the landscape as much as literature. In 1873, Andrew Smith Halliday successfully introduced the cable car system, designed to navigate the city's steep streets more safely than horse-drawn vehicles. Those moving cables became a symbol of ingenuity and resilience. Even today, when you hear the gripman's bell echo between the hills, you are hearing a 19th century solution still in motion. Grand hotels, theaters, and ornate Victorian homes rose across neighborhoods. Nob Hill stood as a statement of wealth and ambition, while bustling commercial districts connected the Pacific coast to global trade. For many Americans looking west, San Francisco represented possibility, refinement, and bold architectural confidence. It was a city that had suffered, learned, and decided to reinvent itself not just as prosperous, but as cultured and unmistakably distinctive. On the morning of the 18th of April, 1906, just before dawn, San Francisco was shaken awake by one of the most powerful earthquakes in American history. Modern estimates place it at about 7.8 inches magnitude. Buildings collapsed within seconds. Brick facades crumbled into the streets. But it was the fires that followed that brought the greatest devastation. Broken gas lines and ruptured water mains left the city burning for days. By the time the flames were finally contained, roughly 80% of San Francisco had been destroyed. Entire neighborhoods vanished. More than 3,000 people lost their lives, though early official reports significantly understated the death toll. City leaders feared that acknowledging the full scale of the disaster might damage San Francisco's reputation and economic future. Families camped in parks and along the waterfront. Landmarks that had symbolized ambition and refinement were reduced to ash. And yet, even in photographs taken days later, you can see something unmistakable in the faces of survivors. Shock, yes. Grief, certainly. But also resolve. For a city that had reinvented itself before, this was another brutal turning point. The earthquake did not end San Francisco's story. It forced the city to rebuild, rethink infrastructure, and confront its vulnerabilities. When you stand in San Francisco today, it is worth remembering that beneath the skyline lies a history not only of ambition, but of resilience forged in fire. For me, the story of 19th century San Francisco is not just about gold or earthquakes. It is about people who kept rebuilding, redefining who they were in the face of uncertainty. That resilience feels deeply American and deeply human. I would truly love to hear your thoughts. What part of this history stayed with you the most? Share it in the comments so we can reflect together. And if you value honest, carefully researched storytelling, please consider subscribing to Robert's History. I look forward to exploring the past with you again soon.